They were warriors, then prisoners, then pensioners holding government checks. And finally, ghost-like figures fighting not on a battlefield, but inside the memory of Europe itself. It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? But the full story is even stranger. Within only 3 years after surrender, some of them were standing in courtrooms, hearing the judgment of history. 8 years later, a small group of former Waffen SS soldiers, those who were not charged with crimes and were treated as regular conscripts, began receiving pensions from West Germany, although this group was much smaller than the whole force. And 4 decades later, a veterans group they created tried to influence how the public remembered the Waffen SS, but in the end, they could not change the official historical memory of Germany. Today, 80 years later, their legacy still burns like hidden embers, strong enough to spark protests from Riga to Berlin. So what really happened when Hitler's black uniformed elite laid down their weapons and discovered that peace could be even more complicated than war? May 7th, 1945. Rain hammered down on a muddy field near Flensburg in northern Germany. A young officer stood among thousands of SS soldiers preparing to hand over their equipment, a scene repeated at several collection points around Flensburg. The double lightning bolts of the SS, once worn with pride, now marked them for judgment. The silence struck him most. 20,000 soldiers, and you could hear raindrops hitting canvas tents. No one spoke. No one dared ask the question burning in every mind. What happens to us now? The answer would unfold across 5 decades in ways no one standing in that rain could have imagined. The surrender came in waves across Europe. In Austria, American troops might have seen small groups of SS soldiers from different units coming in to surrender, because many SS formations broke apart and retreated in several directions during the last days of the war. In Bavaria, British soldiers likely sorted through thousands of prisoners, trying to separate regular Wehrmacht from black-uniformed SS. And in the north, Soviet forces almost certainly herded captured SS troops into cattle cars, bound for camps in the east, where the death rate was high and many prisoners did not survive to return home. Our composite soldier Klaus, representing a pattern experienced by thousands, probably found himself in American custody by mid-May. Perhaps he'd been with the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard division that had grown into a full combat force. 3 weeks earlier, his unit might have been fighting house to house somewhere in Bavaria. Now he likely stood in a processing line, waiting. Name? A sergeant may have asked without looking up. Richter, Klaus. Hauptsturmführer. The sergeant's pen would have stopped. He'd look up for the first time, eyes moving from face to torn collar. SS? Yes. A mark on the form. A thumb jerked toward a separate area with fresh barbed wire. Over there. Inside the enclosure, men who'd fought together for years probably recognized each other but didn't speak much. What could they say? They'd all seen what the Americans were showing, newsreel footage from Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, images that seemed to come from another world, though they knew it was their world. The conditions in those first camps varied wildly. The American forces had to manage a very large number of prisoners, especially in the Rhineland, which caused many camps to become crowded and short on supplies and kept men in open-air enclosures with minimal shelter. Disease spreads quickly. The British were more systematic, sorting prisoners by rank and unit, trying to identify those who might have committed specific crimes. But the Soviets were most feared. Stories filtered back from the east of many SS prisoners were sent to labor camps in the Soviet Union, where conditions were very harsh and the death rate was high, which made many people fear they might never return. Another young man, we'll call him Heinrich, was perhaps only 17 when they'd drafted him in late 1944. He might have been sent to a training camp for 3 weeks, issued an ill-fitting uniform, then shipped to a unit trying to hold back the Soviet advance. He'd probably fired his rifle maybe a dozen times before his unit surrendered. Now, at 18, Sitting in a prisoner camp in Austria, he likely wondered what category he fell into. Victim? Perpetrator? Soldier? Criminal? The answer would come from Nuremberg. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg had survived Allied bombing largely intact, a dark irony given its coming purpose. Starting in November 1945, the world's attention turned to that courtroom as 24 Nazi leaders faced charges. Among the organizations being judged was the SS itself, including the Waffen SS military branch. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson argued that the SS had been essential to Hitler's crimes. Not just the concentration camp guards or death squads, he claimed, but the entire organization, including its military wing. Every man who wore those lightning bolts had enabled the machine of genocide. In prisoner camps across Germany, SS veterans likely listened to radio reports with growing dread. Some may have maintained their innocence, insisting they'd been soldiers like any other. Others probably stayed silent, wrestling with memories that would haunt them forever. On September 30th, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its verdict. The tribunal declared the SS a criminal organization, but it also made clear that people who had been forced to join, especially in the late war Waffen SS, were not considered criminals only because of their membership. The tribunal stated that voluntary membership in the SS, along with knowledge of its criminal actions, could be used as a basis for legal responsibility, while people who were forced to join were treated differently. The words must have echoed through the camps like a death sentence. But there were exceptions. The tribunal recognized that toward the war's end, as Germany grew desperate, many young men had been conscripted into the Waffen-SS against their will. Anyone drafted after 1943, or who could prove they'd had no real choice, might be considered differently. Those who could demonstrate they'd never participated in criminal activities might also be treated less harshly. These distinctions created a cascade of denazification courts across occupied Germany. German judges, working under Allied supervision, tried to sort millions of former Nazis into categories from major offenders to followers. For former Waffen-SS members, everything depended on rank, where you'd served, and sometimes just luck. Some cases were clear. Kurt Meyer, an SS brigade Führer who'd commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division, was tried by a Canadian military court for command responsibility in the killing of Canadian prisoners, even though the court did not prove that he gave a direct order. Evidence was presented. Meyer was convicted and imprisoned. Justice in his case was relatively straightforward. But what about men like our composite Klaus? A junior officer, yes, but a low-ranking one. He'd probably fought on the Eastern Front, where the war had been brutal beyond description. Had he followed orders that, in retrospect, might have been criminal? Possibly. Could anyone prove it specifically? Probably not. His case likely wound up before a denazification court in late 1946. The judge, a middle-aged German who'd spent the war keeping his head down, might have looked over the file. It says here you volunteered in 1941. Is that correct? Yes, sir. You understand that voluntary membership in the SS is viewed more seriously than conscription. I understand that now, sir. The judge probably sighed. He'd seen hundreds of these cases. The court may have classified our Klaus as Category 3 lesser offender. Ineligible for certain employment, needing permission to travel, carrying this mark on his record. But no prison. By March 1947, he was perhaps released. A guard at the gate might have handed him discharge papers and a small amount of money. Where will you go? Klaus probably looked at the paper, then at the road. Home. If there's anything left. Winter in Germany, 1946 to 1947, was brutal. The country lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its economy shattered, its people hungry and cold. For returning prisoners, including those who'd worn the SS uniform, the question wasn't about justice anymore, it was about survival. Heinrich might have made it back to his village in Bavaria to find his father's house still standing, though windows were blown out and someone had used the back room as a stable. His mother probably cried when she saw him. His father may have stood in the doorway, looking at Heinrich's uniform jacket, stripped of insignia but still recognizably military, and said nothing for a long moment. "You'll need to find work," his father might have finally said. "The village knows where you served. It would be better if you didn't talk about it." That pattern likely repeated for thousands of former SS men. Don't talk about it. Don't mention it. Let it fade like a bad dream. But not everyone stayed. Some made different choices. In post-war Europe's chaos, with millions of displaced persons moving across borders and false documents available to anyone with connections or money, a certain number of former SS officers saw an opportunity. They would disappear, start over somewhere far from Europe's prying eyes and vengeful survivors. Karl Nicolussi Lech had been a panzer commander who'd survived the Eastern Front. By 1948, using papers possibly provided by sympathetic networks, perhaps connected to the Catholic Church, perhaps to other organizations, the truth remains debated. He was on a ship to Argentina. Juan Perón's government welcomed German technicians with few questions asked. Nicolussi Lech would live out his days in South America, never facing trial, never returning to Europe. Similar routes apparently led other fugitives to Spain, Syria, Egypt. The so-called rat lines that may have helped Nazi war criminals escape have been partly documented, partly shrouded in rumor. What's certain is that some men did escape and spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. But most stayed. They stayed because they had families, because they had no money for passage, or simply because they couldn't imagine becoming someone else in a foreign land. They stayed and tried to rebuild lives in a country that despised what they'd been, but desperately needed working hands. By 1948, Klaus was perhaps working construction in Munich, helping rebuild the same city Allied bombs had destroyed. He might have told co-workers he'd been in an infantry unit, Wehrmacht, nothing special. Some probably suspected the truth, the way he carried himself, the tactical awareness marking men who'd seen serious combat. But Germany in those years ran on mutual silence. Don't ask, don't tell, don't remember. At night, though, men like Klaus may have lain awake wondering about Nuremberg's verdict. Criminal organization. Those words meant something, even if courts had let them go. They meant history had judged them and found them wanting. The question that may have kept them awake was simpler and more terrible. Were they right? May 23rd, 1949. In Bonn, a quiet city on the Rhine, the Federal Republic of Germany came into existence. Church bells rang, and leaders spoke about democracy and peace, while the Western Allies slowly returned sovereignty to the Germans. For men like Heinrich, now 22 and working in a small factory, the question was simple, but heavy. What kind of country will this become? One that punishes the past, or one that tries to move forward? The answer soon proved complicated. Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor, had opposed the Nazis, but understood political reality. Around 250,000 former Waffen SS soldiers lived in West Germany, and this number was large enough to shape life in the young republic. They had families, they voted, and they were increasingly frustrated. At first, the Allies followed the Nuremberg ruling, which called the entire SS a criminal organization, and this also included the Waffen SS, even though some late-war conscripts were treated as exceptions, and former SS members were blocked from government jobs, public service, and pensions. But the Cold War shifted priorities. With the Soviet Union rising as a major threat, West Germany needed stability and unity. This pressure finally surfaced in 1950 during debates on the Federal War Victims Relief Act, a law meant to support disabled veterans and widows. Then came the explosive question: should former Waffen-SS members be included? The argument split the Bundestag. Conservatives said excluding SS veterans would create a bitter underclass. Opponents, especially survivor groups, warned that treating SS men as normal soldiers was a deep moral wrong. Outside the parliament, Jewish and survivor groups protested strongly, saying that giving benefits to former Waffen SS soldiers was not true reconciliation, but a painful insult to those who had suffered. In 1953, Adenauer made this remark inside his party meeting, saying that the men of the Waffen SS had fought as soldiers, just like others, and the comment soon spread and shaped public opinion. These words changed the national mood. Many SS veterans felt suddenly re-accepted. Werner, a composite figure, may have been 36 when he heard the speech and felt a sense of vindication. During the 1950s, especially after the 131 law of 1951, the pension system slowly opened the door for many former Waffen SS soldiers, mainly late-war conscripts who had no convictions, to apply for benefits. The payments were small, but recognition mattered more. Klaus, now a construction foreman, may have stared at his first pension check, feeling cautiously welcomed back into society. But limits remained. In 1955, West Germany created the Bundeswehr, a new military for the NATO alliance. Officially, former SS men could apply. In practice, strict screening kept most out. Heinrich, now nearly 30, may have applied honestly and received a polite rejection. By 1956, of more than 3,000 former SS applicants, only about 16% were accepted. During these years, Germany walked a delicate line, reintegrating former SS members while refusing to celebrate their past. Most veterans stayed quiet. Many, like Heinrich, learned that silence was safer. At work, older men told war stories about Africa or Italy, but Heinrich rarely spoke. Mentioning black SS uniforms raised too many questions. Meanwhile, survivor groups kept protesting public recognition of SS veterans. Their efforts created a constant tension, a society trying to rebuild while others demanded memory and accountability. By the late 1950s, West Germany's economic miracle brought prosperity. Money softened memories. Klaus, now running a small workshop, avoided details about his wartime service. "I served in the East," he might say, enough to satisfy curiosity. Yet silence carried its own price. Many SS veterans felt they had followed orders, fought for their country, and rebuilt their lives faithfully. But they were still treated as a shadowed group, accepted, yet never fully trusted. Beginning in the early 1950s, former Waffen SS soldiers formed their own veterans groups, and by the early 1960s, these organizations had grown stronger and were willing to challenge the old bargain of silence. HIAG was created in 1951 through the merger of several Waffen SS veterans groups in Bonn, and Paul Hauser and Otto Kumm soon became two of its most visible early leaders. "Gentlemen," he said, and the room fell quiet. "We were soldiers. Not angels, not devils, soldiers. We fought for Germany, and we fought well. History may judge the regime we served, but it cannot judge away our service, our sacrifices, or our honor." Next to him sat Otto Kumm and Felix Steiner, both former generals. They'd come together to found HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members. Werner, attending that first meeting, may have felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Pride, perhaps, or at least its memory. These weren't broken men begging for scraps. These were leaders standing up and saying, "We deserve recognition." HIAG started modestly. The official purpose was welfare, helping former SS men denied pensions, assisting families, providing legal support. In a Germany where former SS members were often excluded from official veteran organizations, HIAG offered community and support. But it quickly evolved into something more ambitious, a political lobby and a historical project. The central argument HIAG developed was elegant in its simplicity. The Waffen SS, they claimed, had been a military formation, not a political one. Yes, it had been part of the larger SS organization, but the men who'd served in combat divisions had been soldiers engaged in military operations, not concentration camp guards or killing squad members. They'd fought at the front, often with skill and bravery. They deserved to be remembered as soldiers, not lumped together with the worst Nazi crimes. It was in many ways a brilliant reframing. It acknowledged terrible things had happened while separating the Waffen SS from direct responsibility. It appealed to universal soldierly values, courage, discipline, loyalty to comrades, while sidestepping ideology. And it found an audience. By the mid-1950s, HIAG had chapters across West Germany and claimed tens of thousands of members. They published Der Freiwillige, the volunteer, featuring articles about famous battles, profiles of decorated soldiers, arguments for why the Waffen-SS deserved proper recognition. They organized reunions where aging veterans could meet old comrades and feel less alone with their complicated pasts. Conservative politicians took notice. West Germany's political system ran on votes, and here was an organized bloc with clear demands. Some politicians began attending HIAG events, giving speeches, and posing for photos. Several conservative politicians, including Franz Josef Strauss, expressed sympathy for former Waffen-SS soldiers. Strauss wrote a supportive letter in 1957, although there is no confirmed record of him speaking at a HIAG rally in 1956. Even Adenauer, privately, met with HIAG leaders. His 1953 statement about Waffen-SS men fighting just like others had partly been a response to HIAG lobbying. Klaus joined HIAG in 1955. The yearly dues were modest, and meetings gave him something he hadn't realized he was missing: a place where he could talk about his service without shame. At HIAG gatherings, men swapped battle stories, remembered fallen comrades, sang old songs that would have gotten them in trouble elsewhere. It wasn't about politics, he might later claim, though that was perhaps more complicated than he wanted to admit. It was about brotherhood. About being with men who understood. The key to HIAG's success was legitimization through publication. They didn't just tell their story, they published it, gave it the weight of printed words and historical argument. In 1953, Paul Hauser published Waffen-SS in Action, and he later released Soldiers Like Any Other in 1966, which became his most influential book, Soldiers Like Any Other. It became the cornerstone for HIAG's interpretation of history. Hauser argued, using careful language and selective evidence, that the Waffen-SS had been a conventional military force operating under military law. Yes, there had been war crimes, but these were exceptions, actions of individuals rather than organizational policy. The vast majority of Waffen-SS soldiers, he claimed, had behaved honorably according to war rules. The book sold well, was reviewed in mainstream newspapers, entered university libraries. It gave academic respectability to arguments that made survivors furious. Throughout the 1960s, HIAG financed memoirs, unit histories, collections of letters from fallen soldiers. These weren't crude apologies for Nazism. HIAG was careful to avoid that, but rather attempts to rehabilitate the Waffen-SS image through selective memory and careful framing. At HIAG rallies, which grew larger through the 1960s, you might see hundreds of men in their 40s and 50s, wearing suits and medals, gathering to remember. They'd raise beer steins, sing soldier songs, honor the dead. To participants, it looked like any veteran gathering. To outside observers, especially those who'd suffered under Nazi occupation, it looked like something darker, nostalgia for a regime that should never be mourned. Werner rose through HIAG ranks to perhaps become a regional organizer. He genuinely believed in what he saw as their modest goals. "We're not denying anything," he might have said when challenged. "We're simply asking that individual soldiers be judged on individual actions, not on their unit name. Is that so unreasonable? But critics argued you couldn't separate the Waffen-SS from its context that easily. The organization had sworn personal oaths to Hitler. It had been created specifically to be the military expression of Nazi ideology. And research was beginning to show Waffen-SS units had participated in war crimes far more extensively than Hayag acknowledged. Massacres of civilians, anti-partisan operations that were really mass murder, support for killing squads. By the late 1960s, cracks were starting to show. Germany's younger generation was asking questions their parents hadn't wanted to answer. The protests of 1968, students demanding accountability, professors researching archives, all of it created an environment where the comfortable silences of the 1950s no longer held. Historians began publishing careful studies of specific Waffen-SS divisions, documenting participation in atrocities. The 3rd SS Division Totenkopf in France, the 2nd SS Division Das Reich at Oradour-sur-Glane, the 12th SS Division Hitler Youth executing prisoners in Normandy. The evidence was damning and specific. Hayag responded defensively, claiming these were isolated incidents, that all armies commit crimes in war, that focusing on the SS was unfair. But the argument sounded increasingly hollow. During the 1970s and 1980s, major German magazines such as Der Spiegel and Stern published investigations into Hayag and its influence, which increased public pressure on the organization. Reporters had spent months reviewing documents, interviewing members, tracing political connections. The article revealed the extent of HIAG's lobbying efforts, its financial support from certain politicians, and its attempts to pressure officials on pension policy. It also showed how HIAG had systematically downplayed or denied war crimes. The scandal was significant. Mainstream parties began distancing themselves. Journalists became more skeptical. Public opinion, especially among younger Germans, turned against them. Klaus, now 58, attended a Hayag rally in 1978 that was surrounded by protesters. Young people with signs stood outside. No honor for war criminals. Remember the victims, not the perpetrators. Police kept the group separated, but Klaus could hear the chants as he walked in. It hurt in a way he hadn't expected. We fought for Germany. He thought, we bled for this country, and Germany's children call us murderers. Heinrich never joined Hayag. He'd moved on with his life, married a woman who knew his history, but didn't define him by it, raised children who asked uncomfortable questions he tried to answer honestly. He understood why some men needed HIAG, needed that community of shared experience. But he couldn't join. Too many lies we told ourselves. He'd say years later. Not big lies, but little ones. The lie that we didn't know. The lie that we were just following orders. The lie that it would have been worse to refuse. Maybe some of those lies were true for some men, but organizations like Hayag made it easy to believe them for everyone. Through the 1980s, Hayag continued but diminished. Membership declined as veterans aged and died. Local chapters closed. Rallies grew smaller. Anti-fascist organizations protested every public gathering. The comfortable space Hayag had created in the 1950s no longer existed. Hayag ended its work at the federal level in 1992, although some local chapters and the group's magazine continued for many years afterward. The question was whether its ideas would end with it. November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall fell, and with it fell the divisions that had shaped post-war Europe. Within a year, Germany was reunified, and the country faced integrating two different societies, two different memories of the war. Led to a slow opening of archives. Step by step, files that had been locked away in East Berlin and other parts of the former Eastern Bloc became available to researchers. And what they revealed complicated every story that had been told. By the mid-1990s, historians could combine older West German and Allied records with newly opened Eastern European archives, and together these sources showed very clearly how closely the Waffen SS had worked with police units and killing squads. Unit diaries, after-action reports, survivor testimony all painted a picture of an organization deeply implicated in the regime's worst crimes. The myth that Hiag had promoted for decades, the idea of the Waffen-SS as a clean, apolitical fighting force, was steadily broken down in serious scholarship, and the new documents from the East made that myth even harder to defend. Klaus, now in his 70s, read a newspaper article in 1995 about newly discovered documents related to his old division. The article described operations he didn't remember, or perhaps had chosen not to remember: villages burned, civilians executed as partisans without trial. He sat with the paper on his lap for a long time. Did I know? He asked himself. It was a question that had haunted him for 50 years. Did I participate? I was there. I wore the uniform. Does it matter if I personally pulled a trigger or just stood nearby? He didn't have a good answer. But the past wasn't done with Germany yet. In the 1990s, journalists discovered that under the old Federal War Victims Relief Act, some former Waffen-SS members were still collecting state pensions. The law, passed in 1950 and shaped by Cold War political pressures, treated them as regular veterans. Now, decades later, this felt obscene to many. Der Spiegel and the New York Times both ran articles pointing out the moral inconsistency. Here was Germany paying benefits to men who'd served in an organization declared criminal at Nuremberg, while many Holocaust survivors had never received comparable compensation. The articles sparked outrage, particularly in Jewish communities and among survivor organizations. How could a country that had worked so hard to reckon with its past still be cutting checks to SS veterans? Politicians scrambled to respond. Some called for immediate law changes. Others pointed out pensions were based on legal commitments made decades ago. You couldn't simply revoke benefits because public opinion had changed. The contracts were binding. It was, in some ways, the perfect symbol of Germany's complicated relationship with its past. The country had genuinely reckoned with Nazi crimes in ways few nations have managed. Museums, memorials, education programs, Germany had done the work of remembrance. But that work coexisted with legal and political structures created in an earlier era when different priorities had prevailed. The pension issue was never fully resolved. Laws were modified around the edges, but not fundamentally changed. Some former SS men continued receiving benefits until they died. The moral discomfort remained. Meanwhile, in a development that surprised many Germans, the Waffen-SS's image was being rehabilitated in unexpected places: Eastern Europe. In Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine, veterans of locally recruited SS divisions began being commemorated as national heroes. The narrative was complicated, but had a certain logic. These men had fought against Soviet occupation, and in the post-Soviet era, that fight was being remembered as resistance against tyranny, rather than service to Nazism. Every year in Riga, marchers honor the Latvian Legion, the 15th and 19th Waffen-SS divisions, composed of Latvian volunteers and conscripts. They carry flowers, wear traditional dress, celebrate men they see as having fought for Latvian independence, even if they fought in German uniforms under German command. The marches provoked fierce condemnation from Jewish organizations, the European Parliament, and historians who pointed out these units had participated in the Holocaust in the Baltic region. But supporters argued the situation was more complex, that these men had been caught between two totalitarian powers and chose what seemed the lesser evil. It revealed an uncomfortable truth. The same historical figures could be seen as war criminals in one country and freedom fighters in another, depending on which aspects of their service were emphasized and which were minimized. The arguments Hiag had made in the 1950s, that Waffen-SS soldiers were motivated by anti-communism rather than Nazism, that they were defending Europe rather than fighting for Hitler, found new life in post-Soviet Eastern Europe, where anti-Russian sentiment made any Soviet enemy potentially sympathetic. Inside Germany, however, tolerance for any Waffen SS celebration was approaching zero. By the 2000s, displaying SS symbols in public was a crime under Section 86A of the Criminal Code. Far-right groups tried getting around this by using historical imagery for educational purposes or posting online where enforcement was harder. Authorities cracked down repeatedly, viewing any SS glorification as a threat to democracy. The internet created new problems. Neo-Nazi groups could use SS imagery in forums and social media, portraying the Waffen-SS as symbols of strength or European brotherhood fighting communism. These weren't aging HIAG veterans arguing for recognition. These were younger extremists appropriating symbols they barely understood. German intelligence services monitored these groups carefully. History's lesson was clear. Symbols of terror could be revived, could find new audiences if democratic societies weren't vigilant. For the few surviving Waffen-SS veterans, this appropriation by extremists was often unwelcome. Whatever they'd believed about their service, however they'd justified it to themselves, most didn't want their history fueling new hatreds. Heinrich, in his 90s and living in a small Munich apartment, occasionally got calls from journalists or researchers. They wanted to know what he remembered, what he thought about the marches in Latvia or the neo-Nazis online. "I remember everything," he'd tell them. "That's my burden. Every face, every order, every moment. I was 17. That doesn't excuse anything, but it's the truth. I served in an organization that did terrible things. I don't know if I personally did terrible things. I've spent 70 years trying to remember clearly, and I still don't know. But the uniform I wore was part of it." When asked about modern uses of SS imagery, he was clear. "They're fools. They think the symbols meant strength and brotherhood. They don't understand those symbols meant death camps and mass graves. History isn't costumes and flags, it's consequences." The academic understanding of the Waffen-SS evolved significantly from the 1990s onward. Historians like Sönke Neitzel and Peter Longerich published detailed studies examining how ideology, military discipline, and violence intertwined within the organization. Their research made clear the Waffen-SS had never been separate from Nazi politics. It had been the armed expression of Nazi ideology from its inception. The oath every Waffen-SS man swore was to Hitler personally, not to Germany or its constitution. Training emphasized racial theory alongside military tactics. Organizational culture celebrated ruthlessness. And unit after unit had participated in war crimes as standard practice, not isolated incidents. By the 2000s, historical consensus was overwhelming. Hayek's narrative had been false. The Waffen-SS was not, and had never been, an organization of soldiers like any other. But understanding came too late for accountability in most cases. By 2010, almost all Waffen-SS veterans had died. The youngest would have been in their 80s. The last war crimes trials of Nazi perpetrators wrapped up. The generation that wore the uniforms was passing, leaving only memory and argument behind. Klaus died in 2003 at age 82. His obituary in the local paper identified him as a businessman and veteran, with no mention of which uniform he'd worn. His children knew, but they'd never discussed it much. His grandchildren were only vaguely aware their grandfather had been involved in something complicated during the war. Werner died earlier, in 1989, just before the wall fell. He'd believed until the end that history would eventually vindicate the Waffen-SS, that future generations would understand they'd been soldiers doing their duty. History had other plans. Heinrich Bauer, as of recent years, might still be alive, though he'd be in his late 90s. If he is, he represents one of the last living links to that generation, that experience, that impossible question of how ordinary men become part of extraordinary evil. So what happened to the Waffen-SS after World War II? They dispersed across Germany and Europe. Some were imprisoned, some tried, most eventually released. They struggled to find work, build new lives, reconcile what they'd done with who they wanted to be. A few fled to South America. Most stayed and stayed silent. During the 1950s, some former Waffen SS members were brought back into West German society. But this process was uneven. Pension rules were debated for years, and only a small, carefully screened number were allowed to join the new Bundeswehr. And through organizations like HIAG, they mounted a sophisticated campaign to reshape how they were remembered, arguing they'd been soldiers rather than war criminals, motivated by patriotism rather than ideology. For a time, that campaign succeeded. Some conservative politicians tried to reach out to former Waffen-SS veterans or showed sympathy toward them, although this was not the position of the entire conservative bloc. Publishers printed their memoirs. They held rallies without interference. In the comfortable amnesia of the 1950s and early 60s, Germany seemed willing to move past uncomfortable questions. But history has a way of catching up. Student movements of the late 1960s demanded accountability. Archives opened, survivors testified, historians researched, and the careful myth HIAG had constructed crumbled under evidence weight. HIAG ended its work at the federal level in 1992, although some local chapters and publications continued for many years afterward. Museums and memorials began to present the story in a more complete way, even though the debate about the past continued. Education programs ensured young Germans understood what had been done. The comfortable silence was replaced with uncomfortable truth. Yet even now, the story isn't finished. In Eastern Europe, some still commemorate Waffen-SS units as anti-Soviet fighters. Online, extremists appropriate SS symbols for new hatreds. And in Germany, a few very elderly men may still receive pensions under laws reflecting different times and priorities. Their story remains a warning about how easily history can be reshaped, how groups can claim victimhood while avoiding responsibility, and how long terror's echoes can resound. It's also a lesson about justice, how hard it is to achieve, how imperfect it always is, and how economic and political pressures can compromise moral clarity. In German cemeteries today, you'll find plain stones marking former Waffen-SS members' graves. No double lightning bolts, no unit insignia, just names and dates. The symbols they wore with pride became symbols of infamy. The organization they served was declared criminal. The myths they tried to create were dismantled by historians. They were reintegrated but never fully accepted. Pardoned in practice but not exonerated in memory. Some former soldiers received certain benefits under post-war laws, while many others did not qualify. But public honor was never restored to them. They told their stories but lost the argument with history. And perhaps that's the final answer to what happened. They survived the war, rebuilt their lives, and spent decades fighting over how they'd be remembered. They fought that battle with words and lobbying and selective memory. And ultimately, they lost. History judged the Waffen-SS harshly, reflecting Nuremberg's ruling that the SS was a criminal organization, although the tribunal did distinguish between voluntary members and those who were forced to join. The thunder of their guns faded long ago. The men themselves are nearly gone. What remains is the eternal question they embodied. How do societies judge, punish, rehabilitate, and remember those who served evil? There are no perfect answers, only the messy, imperfect, contested process of trying to balance justice with practicality, memory with reconciliation, truth with peace. That's what happened to the Waffen-SS after World War II. Their story, uncomfortable and unfinished, continues shaping how we think about war, guilt, and history's long shadow. If you found this story insightful and want to explore more hidden chapters of history, subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the events and people that shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.